It's the summer of 1876. The United States believes itself unstoppable, an empire destined to tame the wild frontier. And at the center of this grand illusion stands a golden-haired general, George Armstrong Custer. As he crests a lonely ridge in Montana, he looks down on a vast native village stretching for miles. Thousands of warriors wait below, far more than his scouts ever reported. Any sane commander would hesitate, but not Custer. He raises his hat, grins, and shouts, "Hurrah, boys, we've got them." What he doesn't realize is chilling. He's about to ride straight into one of the largest native war camps ever assembled. Reinforcements aren't coming, and within just 1 hour, his command will be gone, every man dead. This is not the story of American triumph. This is the unbelievable tragedy of Custer's last stand. But how did a young officer, once hailed as a Civil War hero, end up leading his men into one of the most catastrophic defeats in U.S. history? Why did his ambition blind him to the danger? Who were the native leaders who outmaneuvered him? And how did this single battle shatter America's illusion of invincibility? Today, we uncover the full story, one of recklessness, betrayal, and defiance. George Armstrong Custer wasn't born into privilege. He was the son of a farmer in Ohio, but from the start he carried himself like someone destined for glory. Sharp, bold, and almost obnoxiously proud, he wasn't just ambitious, he craved immortality in the history books. When he entered West Point in 1857, his behavior was legendary for all the wrong reasons. He racked up 726 disciplinary reports, more than any cadet before him. But behind the troublemaker was a spark his instructors couldn't deny. He had the instincts of a born fighter. The Civil War exploded in 1861, and suddenly the restless cadet had his chance. Custer quickly rose through the ranks, leading from the front with reckless courage. He never asked a man to do something he wouldn't do himself, and his soldiers adored him for it. By the age of 23, he was one of the youngest generals in U.S. history. Newspapers loved his flamboyant style, his long golden hair, and his daring charges. They called him the Boy General. At Gettysburg in 1863, Custer and his cavalry stopped Confederate troops from breaking the Union line at a critical moment. His courage may well have saved the battle, and perhaps even the Union itself. By the war's end, the table Robert E. Lee surrendered on was gifted to Custer's wife, with the inscription, "No man has done more to secure this surrender than your husband." Custer's name was synonymous with victory, but glory is addictive, and he would never have enough. When the Civil War ended, the nation turned west. Settlers flooded across the plains, and with them came conflict with the native nations who had lived there for centuries. Custer, now in command of the 7th Cavalry, was sent to deal with what Washington called the Indian problem. For a man hungry for honor, it felt like an insult. Fighting scattered raiding parties on the frontier wasn't the stuff of legends, but Custer had no choice. In 1868, his chance came. The Lakota Sioux and their Cheyenne allies were resisting U.S. encroachment. Officially, the Fort Laramie Treaty guaranteed them the Black Hills. Unofficially, the government had no intention of respecting it. Gold and land were too tempting. Most Sioux leaders reluctantly agreed to the treaty, but one man refused, Sitting Bull. Where Custer was rash and flamboyant, Sitting Bull was calm and deliberate. His name came from his habit of thinking deeply before acting. He was not only a war chief, but also a spiritual leader, claiming visions that guided him in resistance. By his side was his ally Gall, a fierce warrior with personal grudges, and later Crazy Horse, a young fearless Lakota, known for visions of his own. Together they would forge a coalition, unlike anything the U.S. Army expected. Custer's first major campaign came in November 1868, when his scouts found a Cheyenne camp in present-day Oklahoma. At dawn, he led his cavalry in a furious charge. Gunfire ripped through teepees. Warriors fought back, but many who fell were women and children. Custer declared it a glorious victory. Over 100 Cheyenne were dead, But the reality was far darker. The village he struck belonged to a chief friendly to the U.S. Peace was shattered. Worse, when his second-in-command, Major Joel Elliott, pursued fleeing warriors, Custer refused to wait for him. Elliott and all 20 of his men were found later, mutilated. Many in the 7th Cavalry never forgave him. Captain Frederick Benteen became his loudest critic, calling Elliott's death Custer's fault. Their feud would one day have deadly consequences. Still, Washington loved the headlines. Custer was painted as a frontier hero, the man who would tame the West. By 1873, Custer was stationed at Fort Abraham Lincoln in Dakota Territory. He surrounded himself with loyal allies, his brothers Tom and Boston, his brother-in-law James Calhoun, even his wife Libby. But he also gained bitter rivals. Major Marcus Reno, plagued by alcoholism, detested Custer's arrogance. Captain Benteen loathed him even more. The 7th Cavalry was a divided command. Among Custer's scouts was Bloody Knife, a half-Sioux, half-Araucana with a personal vendetta against Sitting Bull and Gall. Childhood grudges and family killings had made him Custer's eager ally. Their fates would become intertwined. In 1874, Custer led an expedition into the Black Hills. Officially, it was to find a fort site. In reality, it was a propaganda stunt and a hunt for gold. The press followed him, publishing photos of the dashing general on horseback, his long hair blowing in the wind. When gold was found, the nation erupted. A gold rush swept into the Black Hills, treaty or no treaty. By late 1875, 15,000 settlers had poured in. President Ulysses S. Grant gave the Sioux an ultimatum: move on to reservations by January 1876, or be declared hostile. It was an impossible demand in the middle of winter. War was inevitable. In May 1876, the Army launched its campaign. General Alfred Terry commanded the operation, with Custer leading the 7th Cavalry. Other columns under General Gibbon and General Crook would close in from different directions, the plan being to trap Sitting Bull's people like cattle. But Sitting Bull was ready. His visions told him the soldiers would fall like grass before the storm. He gathered thousands of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, nearly 8,000 in all. It was the largest native coalition the Plains had ever seen. On June 17th, Crazy Horse struck first. With 1,500 warriors, he attacked Crook's column along the Rosebud River. Against all odds, they fought the Americans to a standstill, forcing Crook to retreat. Critically, Crook never warned Custer or Terry of the defeat. Sitting Bull's people moved to the valley they called the Greasy Grass, what Americans knew as the Little Bighorn. There, during the Sundance, Sitting Bull had another vision: soldiers falling upside down into their camp. To his followers, it was a prophecy of victory. By June 25, Custer and his 700 men were closing in. Scouts warned him. The trail showed far more warriors than expected, perhaps thousands. Even Bloody Knife urged caution, but Custer saw only the chance for everlasting glory. He split his regiment into 3. Reno would attack from the south. Benteen would circle wide with a reserve. Custer himself would strike from the north, bringing his brothers and closest allies. At 3:30 in the afternoon, Custer crested a ridge. Below him stretched a vast sea of tipis, 3 miles long, thousands of people, more than he had ever dreamed. Still, he smiled, raised his hat, and shouted, "Hurrah, boys, we've got them!" And with that, he charged down the hill toward immortality. While Custer rode north, Major Marcus Reno led 150 men across the Little Bighorn River into the southern edge of the camp. The Lakota and Cheyenne were caught by surprise at first. Tipis shook as bullets whistled through, striking men, women, and children alike. Smoke filled the air, but Sitting Bull and Gall were there. Gall saw his wives and children struck down, and grief hardened instantly into rage. Crazy Horse, already mounted, rallied warriors with his unshakable fearlessness. Reno, unsettled and already dulled by whiskey, ordered his men to dismount and form a skirmish line. The prairie grass whipped in the wind as soldiers fired into the camp, but the warriors were coming fast. Gall and Crazy Horse led wave after wave, darting in and out, firing, then vanishing into the tall grass. Reno began to panic. He tried to confer with his scout Bloody Knife, but at that very moment, a bullet struck Bloody Knife in the head. His blood and brain splattered across Reno's face. The major froze in horror. Reno lost his nerve. His orders became confused, desperate. "Any of you wish to make your escape? Follow me," he shouted. Discipline collapsed. Soldiers abandoned their horses, stumbling back toward the river. Warriors rode alongside, shooting down fleeing cavalrymen as they splashed through the water. On the bluffs above, Captain Benteen could hear the chaos. Shots echoed across the valley. When Reno's battered survivors scrambled up the hillside, half their number gone, they begged, "For God's sake, Benteen, hold your command and help us." But the real storm was not with Reno. It was where Custer had gone. Custer had no patience to wait for reinforcements. He intended to smash into the northern edge of the camp, seize women and children as hostages, and force Sitting Bull to surrender. It was a tactic he had used before, but this time he had gravely miscalculated. As Custer's men rode toward the river, warriors hidden in the brush opened fire. Arrows and bullets rained down. Horses screamed. Soldiers tumbled from their saddles. Then, as if the earth itself erupted, Crazy Horse arrived with hundreds of warriors. Dust rose in swirling clouds as they charged in from multiple directions. Custer's men, caught in open ground, faltered. They tried to fall back up a ridge, later named Calhoun Hill. Lieutenant James Calhoun, Custer's brother-in-law, formed a defensive line. Soldiers fired desperately as warriors swarmed around them, but the tide was overwhelming. Warriors on horseback encircled them, while others crawled through the grass, firing from cover. Within minutes, Calhoun's position was crushed. Bodies piled atop one another. Custer himself retreated further north with his brothers Tom and Boston, and about 200 men. They gathered on a rise that would forever be called Last Stand Hill. Imagine the scene. 200 men in blue uniforms, clustered on the slope, smoke and dust filling the air. Arrows hissed. Rifle fire cracked from every direction. Horses bolted. Wounded men screamed. Custer's brother Tom urged the men to hold fast, but Crazy Horse's warriors surged uphill like a living tide. Gall, driven by grief, fought with terrifying ferocity. Soldiers fired until their carbines jammed, then pulled out pistols. Some fought hand to hand. Others tried to crawl away, only to be cut down, the sky filled with war cries. One by one, the companies collapsed. Some accounts say Custer still stood tall, his long golden hair visible amid the chaos, firing until the very last. Sitting Bull would later recall hearing that the long hair stood like a sheaf of corn, with all the ears fallen around him. When the dust settled, silence fell over the ridge. Custer, his brothers, his kin, his officers, all lay dead. The entire northern wing of the 7th Cavalry was annihilated. Back on the bluffs, Reno and Benteen held their ground with the remaining 400 soldiers. From their position, they could hear the echo of gunfire from Custer's direction, but no reinforcements ever came. Some soldiers swore they heard volleys, the desperate final shots of Custer's command. Then came silence. The warriors turned their fury on Reno and Benteen. For hours they circled the hill, firing from the ridges. Soldiers dug rifle pits with their hands, desperate for cover. Through the night the fighting raged. Men clutched canteens, praying for dawn. At last, on June 26, scouts spotted General Terry and Gibbon approaching from the north. The warriors melted away, their victory complete. Sitting Bull ordered his people to move, knowing the army's vengeance would come. When Terry's column reached Reno Hill, the survivors were gaunt, filthy, and shaken. Terry's first question was simple: "Where is Custer?" The answer lay just down the valley. Scouts led Terry and Benteen to the ridge. There, sprawled across the hillside, lay the bodies of over 200 soldiers. Some were stripped, mutilated, or scalped. But among them was the golden-haired general himself. Custer had 2 bullet wounds, one in the chest, one in the head. No one knows if he fell in the fighting or ended his own life to avoid capture. The boy general was gone. News traveled fast. On July 4th, 1876, the very day America celebrated its centennial, the nation rejoiced in its progress, its power, its destiny. Just 2 days later, headlines carried a bitter truth. Custer and his men had been wiped out. The myth of invincibility shattered. Americans were horrified. How could native warriors destroy a U.S. Army regiment? Some blamed Custer for his arrogance, charging ahead for personal glory. Others blamed Reno and Benteen for cowardice and delay. Few gave credit to Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and Gall, who had done the impossible, uniting their people, standing their ground, and defeating the U.S. military in open battle. The victory was real, but it was also fleeting. For the U.S., Custer's defeat was not the end. It was the beginning of an overwhelming campaign of retaliation. Sitting Bull and his followers had won the greatest native victory in history, but it would provoke the storm that ended their freedom. For the Lakota and Cheyenne, victory at the Little Bighorn was exhilarating. Songs were sung, stories were told around the fires, and the warriors carried themselves with pride. They had done what few thought possible, shattered the U.S. Army's illusion of dominance. But Sitting Bull understood what came next. The United States would never forgive such a humiliation. Washington turned Custer's defeat into a rallying cry. Instead of discouraging expansion, it unleashed a wave of vengeance. The newspapers that once mocked Custer now sanctified him. He was no longer a reckless officer, he was a martyr. The full weight of the U.S. Army bore down on the plains. Reinforcements arrived in overwhelming numbers. Supply lines stretched deep into Lakota territory. Soldiers built forts, roads, and telegraph lines. The Lakota coalition, once united in defiance, began to splinter under the constant pressure. Crazy Horse, who had fought with brilliance at both the Rosebud and Little Bighorn, continued to resist. His fearlessness made him almost mythical among his people. But without supplies, without allies, and with the army constantly pursuing them, the warriors were forced to scatter. By May 1877, Crazy Horse finally surrendered, exhausted and betrayed by factions within his own people. He was promised safety at Fort Robinson, Nebraska. Instead, on September 5, 1877, he was stabbed with a bayonet while struggling with guards. The man who had once led charges against entire U.S. armies died in custody, far from the open plains he loved. Sitting Bull refused to surrender. Instead, he led his people north into Canada, beyond the reach of the U.S. Army. There he hoped to find peace. But life in exile was harsh, food was scarce, and the Canadian government offered little aid. His people starved. By 1881, with his band weakened and weary, Sitting Bull returned to U.S. territory and surrendered at Fort Buford. For a time, he lived quietly on a reservation, but Sitting Bull remained a symbol of resistance. He even toured briefly with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, where crowds marveled at the man who had defeated Custer, but fame could not protect him. In 1890, U.S. agents feared he would join the growing ghost dance movement, a religious revival they considered threatening. At dawn on December 15th, police burst into his cabin to arrest him. In the struggle, shots were fired. Sitting Bull was killed, his body left in the snow outside his home. Meanwhile, George Armstrong Custer's legend only grew. To some, he was a fool, an egotistical officer whose hunger for glory doomed his men. To others, he was a tragic hero, a gallant soldier cut down by overwhelming odds. His widow, Libby Custer, spent the rest of her long life fiercely defending his reputation, writing books and giving speeches that painted him as a martyr of American expansion. The truth lies somewhere in between. Custer was brave, yes, but reckless. His brilliance in the Civil War never translated to the plains, where his arrogance blinded him to the reality of native strength. And yet, in death, he achieved what he had always wanted: immortality. The name Custer would forever be remembered, not for victory, but for defeat. For the Lakota and Cheyenne, Little Bighorn was both their greatest triumph and the beginning of the end. The victory united them in the moment, but it brought the full might of the U.S. Army crashing down upon their world. Within a few short years, their freedom was gone, their land seized, their leaders dead or imprisoned. But the memory of that day lived on. The world remembered the warriors who defied an empire, the vision of Sitting Bull, the courage of Crazy Horse, the grief-driven fury of Gall, and above all, the lesson that even the most powerful nations are not invincible. Custer had once stood atop a ridge, hat in hand, shouting, "Hurrah, boys, we've got them!" But in the valley below, history had other plans. On the banks of the Little Bighorn, the myth of American invincibility was broken. And that is the incredible story of Custer's last stand, a clash of ambition, prophecy, and destiny that still echoes through history. But if you want to dive deeper into the personal rivalries that doomed the 7th Cavalry, especially the feud between Reno, Benteen, and Custer, then you'll want to watch my next video. It reveals how betrayal and bitterness inside the U.S. Army may have mattered just as much as Sitting Bull's warriors.